11 summers, 11 young men. Each one ruled an accident. Each one buried with the summer. But numbers don't lie. People do. Lake Harlan remembers everything. This is the drowning season of Lake Harlan, and it is not over. Claire Osei arrived in Harlan on a Tuesday in late June with 2 hard drives, a duffel bag, and a research grant that nobody in this town had asked for. She was 29 years old. She had a master's in behavioral statistics from the University of Minnesota. She had never worked a live case in her life. She had, however, spent 14 months building a data model that said something deeply wrong was living in this lake, and she had come to prove it. 11 drownings over 11 summers, all male, all between 19 and 26 years old. All visitors, not locals, all found within a quarter-mile radius of the same dock, all with blood alcohol content above the legal limit. Every single one ruled accidental. Every single one closed. Statistically, the probability of 11 accidental drownings in a consistent demographic profile at a consistent location across a consistent seasonal window. Claire had run the model 40 times. The number she kept getting wasn't a coincidence. It was a signature. Sheriff Bud Kowalski had been running Harlan County for 22 years. He had closed every one of those 11 cases himself. He had not, technically speaking, invited Claire Osei to his town. The university liaison had sent paperwork. The county board had approved the review over Bud's explicit objection, and now she was back there in his storage room, rearranging his filing system and pinning things to his walls. He watched her shadow move behind the glass. He told himself she would be gone by August. They always were. "I need the original incident reports," Claire said. "Not the summaries, the originals." Bud looked at the paper she was holding out. He did not take it. "Those are closed cases," he said. "Reviewed and closed. By me." "I know." Claire kept her arm extended. "Patient. That's why I need them." The fluorescent tube ticked overhead. Somewhere outside, the lake was still. It was always still. Bud reached for his coffee. He did not reach for the files. Not yet. Deputy Hank Sutter had written 7 of those 11 incident reports. He was 26 when he wrote the first one. He'd stood at the edge of that dock in the early morning light and watched them pull a kid from the water and told himself, "People drown. It happens." He'd told himself that 11 times. He watched the analyst from the university hold her ground against his boss and felt something move in his chest. Something old. Something he'd been sitting on for a very long time. Harlan had a tourism board. It printed brochures. It called Lake Harlan a hidden gem of Minnesota's great outdoors. It did not mention the years. It did not mention the boys. Summer was here again. The water was warm enough to swim in. And somewhere in this town, a pattern that had repeated 11 times was drawing a breath, getting ready to repeat once more. Claire Osei had 14 days before the next statistical window opened. She didn't know that yet, but the lake did. By 11 o'clock, Bud had given her 6 of the 11 original reports. 6. He'd said the other 5 were in archive storage, and that archive storage was not currently accessible. He'd said it with the particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed the sentence. Claire had taken the 6 and said nothing. She'd learned early that silence costs you nothing and reveals everything. She spread them on the floor around her and sat in the middle of them. 11 years, 6 files, 5 absences, and somewhere in the space between what was there and what wasn't, a shape she could almost see. In the 2017 report, victim number 9, there was a dock photograph. Standard scene documentation. Nothing remarkable, except in the background. Left edge of frame, almost cropped out. A figure, standing in the tree line, watching. Claire turned the photograph slowly in the light. The figure was not mentioned anywhere in the report. Not in the witness statements. Not in Hank's notes. She set the photograph down carefully in the center of the circle. Then she took out a fresh index card and wrote one word on it, witness. The mother's name was Diane Mercer. Her son Kevin had been victim number 6, summer 2018, 22 years old. University of Wisconsin, visiting a friend for a long weekend. Claire had found Diane's name in the margin of Hank's report. A handwritten note, circled once. Mother requests follow-up call. There was no record that the follow-up call was ever made. Diane had been living in this house 600 feet from the lake road For 6 years. Claire raised her hand and knocked. The porch light clicked off. Diane Mercer did not offer coffee. She did not make small talk. She looked at Claire for a long moment after Claire explained who she was. "You're not from Bud's office," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Good." Diane's hands unfolded. She reached to the stack of labeled file boxes beside the television, 6 years of her own work, and pulled the top one forward. "Then we can talk properly." Claire looked at the boxes. Then she looked at the woman. 6 years, alone, every door closed, still working. Diane Mercer had documented everything. Dates, weather reports, eyewitness accounts she had gathered herself, boat rental records, bar receipts, names of people who had seen something and then stopped returning her calls. She had mapped the same 11 deaths Claire had mapped. She had drawn the same conclusion 2 years earlier, and she had taken it to Bud. Twice. She told Claire what Bud had said both times, in the same quiet voice she used for everything. She did not cry. She had, Claire understood, run out of the kind of grief that needs witnesses. Claire's finger found it without being guided there. The same tree line, the same position, circled in Diane's red pen across 6 different incident sketches, 6 different years. Someone was always watching. Claire said quietly, "Yes." Diane's voice didn't change. "I told Bud that in 2020. He told me grief can make patterns where there aren't any." Claire straightened slowly. She thought of the photograph on her own corkboard. The figure in the tree line, almost cropped out, almost. He came to the water most nights, not to do anything, just to stand at the edge of the trees and watch the dock breathe in the fog. It calmed him. The same way a finished thing calms the hands that completed it. The way a locked door calms the person who locked it. 11 times. 11 summers. The same dock. The same water. The same quiet after. He knew, the way a man knows his own kitchen in the dark, that the season was opening again. He turned back into the trees. The fog closed behind him without a sound. Hank had retrieved the 2017 report from the archive himself. After Claire had left for the evening, he'd read it 3 times at his desk. His own sentences. His own conclusions. Accidental drowning. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. His own handwriting. 26 letters of certainty that he had signed and filed and never looked at again. He set the paper down flat on the desk, pressed his palm against it. In the margin, circled once in his own hand, Mother requests follow-up call. He closed his eyes. He remembered writing that. He didn't remember ever making the call. By midnight, Claire's map had a new element. 11 incidents. 11 times. Someone standing in the same section of tree line. Never mentioned. Never photographed intentionally. Appearing only in the margin of images taken for other purposes. She stood back and looked at what she had built. A pattern is not a case. Data is not evidence. She knew that. She had been trained to know that. But standing in that room at midnight, looking at 11 red circles clustered around a single point in the trees, she felt something colder than data move through her. Something had been watching this lake for 11 years, and this lake had been protecting it. Claire had arrived at 7. Bud didn't come in until 8:30. She had not planned to talk to Hank, but she found him already there, already at his desk, the 2017 report already in front of him. They looked at each other across it. "You saw the figure?" Claire said. Not a question. Hank's jaw moved. "I saw something. At the time I thought, what did you think?" He was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent tube ticked. "I thought it was probably nothing," he said. "I think I wanted it to be nothing." He looked down at his own handwriting. "That's not the same as it being nothing." "There's something you should know," Hank said, still facing the window. He told her about the summer of 2019. Victim number 10, a kid from Iowa, 20 years old. The morning they found him, there had been a call. Anonymous, male voice, calm, reporting a disturbance near the dock at 2 a.m. The call had come in at 2:07. The body was found at 6:15. "We logged the call," Hank said. "Bud told me to note it as an unrelated noise complaint." He paused. "I noted it as an unrelated noise complaint." Outside, the lake road was empty. It was always empty at this hour, like the town held its breath before the day began. Anonymous call logs. 11 summers. Claire ran the search in under 4 minutes. 7 anonymous calls over 11 years, all male, all reporting a disturbance or a noise near the dock. All between midnight and 3 a.m. All within hours of a drowning. Not one had been traced. Not one had been followed up. She leaned back slowly. Someone called in every time, she said. Hank crossed his arms. Not every time. No, Claire looked at the screen. Not every time. Just the ones where something almost went wrong. The ones where someone else might have seen. She turned to look at him. He was managing the aftermath. Every time. He came to the tap on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He drank coffee. He listened. He was known here. That was the point. Being known was the foundation of everything. A man who is known is a man who belongs. A man who belongs is a man who is not looked at too carefully. He watched the room in the mirror. Regulars. Familiar faces. And then in the corner booth, something new. A young man, university hoodie, out of state, laughing at his phone. The ferryman lifted his coffee cup. He did not stare. He simply allowed the information to settle into him the way water settles into low ground. Quietly. Completely. He had learned a long time ago that patience was indistinguishable from innocence, from the outside. Tommy Greer had driven up from Minneapolis that morning. 4 days at a rental cabin on the Harlan Road. His roommate had canceled last minute. He'd come anyway. He was the kind of person who came anyway. He didn't know anyone in Harlan. He didn't know the lake's history. He had found the rental on an app. The listing had called the location secluded and scenic. He'd thought that sounded good. He ordered another beer. He texted his roommate a photo of the view from the cabin porch. He typed, "You're missing out, man." At the bar, in the mirror, a pair of calm eyes completed their assessment and moved on, unhurried, certain. She stood in his place. That was the thing about statistical analysis. Eventually it brought you to a physical location. A spot on the earth where the numbers became grass and mud and pine needles and a sight line to a dock. From here, you could see everything. The dock, the water, the path from the bar, the rental cabin road beyond the trees. You could watch someone walk from the bar to the dock and never be seen yourself. The trees were close. The shadows were deep. And the ground, Claire pressed her fingers into the soil, was worn. Right here, right in this spot. Not by animals. The weight distribution was wrong for animals. She stood, slowly, turned back toward the lake, felt the particular cold of being watched from memory. Bud made the call at noon. He didn't know Claire had already pulled the anonymous call logs. He didn't know Hank had talked to her before 8. He didn't know about the worn patch of earth in the tree line. What he knew was that a university analyst was asking questions that had been carefully not asked for 11 years. He spoke quietly into the phone. The person on the other end said very little. Bud said, "Asterisk. It's probably nothing. Just wanted you to know someone's looking." Asterisk. He hung up, sat down slowly, across town. Though Bud had no way of knowing this, the person he'd called set down his own phone, looked out his window toward the lake road, and smiled. She'd stopped in for coffee and to think. She noticed the young man at the bar the way she noticed everything, automatically, cataloged without intention. Male, mid-20s, out-of-state hoodie, relaxed posture, alone. Her mind cross-referenced before she could stop it. She looked at the empty stool at the far end of the bar. Something about it pulled at her, the way a gap in a dataset pulls, an absence where a presence had been. She ordered coffee. She opened her notepad. Across the room, Tommy Greer laughed at something the bartender said. Claire wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. Same victim profile. She put her pen down, looked at him again. Then she picked the pen back up and underlined it. "Sorry, are you working?" "I can. It's fine," Claire said. She closed the notepad. His name was Tommy. He was from Minneapolis. 4 days at a rental on the lake road. He said it the way people say things when they have nothing to hide. Completely. Immediately. With detail. Claire noted every word. She noted the cabin location. She noted which road. She noted that he was alone. She smiled when he expected her to. She asked the questions that kept him talking. She was not being friendly. She was building a profile. And everything he told her confirmed what she had already written on the page. Same victim profile, same lake, same season, same window. She stared at his name for a long time. She had no case. She had a data model and a worn patch of earth in a tree line, and 7 anonymous phone calls that had never been traced. She had a dead deputy's note about a follow-up call that was never made. She had a photograph with a figure in the margin. She did not have enough to go to Bud. She did not have enough to go anywhere. But she had a 24-year-old man in a university hoodie, staying alone in a cabin on the lake road. Claire picked up her coffee, put it down again. She thought about her brother, about the call she'd gotten 4 years ago, about the word accident, spoken in a voice that left no room for questions. She picked up her pen. Beneath Tommy's name, she wrote, "Do not let this become File 12. Diane read the call log printouts without speaking. She read them the way Claire had come to understand. She read everything, completely, without rushing, giving each line its full weight before moving to the next. When she finished, she set them down precisely aligned on her knee. "He called in number 4, she said. "Kevin, summer 2018. The log shows a call at 1:47 a.m. She looked up at Claire. Kevin's time of death was estimated between midnight and 3. Yes, he called in his own. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again in the same quiet voice. "He called in to manage it, the way you said. Yes." Diane looked down at the printout, then back at Claire. "You need to find whose voice that is." The folder contained 14 interviews. Diane had conducted them herself over 3 months in 2018 and 2019. Neighbors, bar staff, dock rental employees, a retired park ranger who walked the lake road at dawn. Claire turned the pages slowly and then stopped. Page 9. A handwritten account from a woman named Ruth Halsey, former Harlan Tap waitress, since moved to Duluth, dated March 2019. Asterisk. There was a regular. Always coffee, never alcohol. Always the same stool. Always there when the summer boys were there. I thought nothing of it for years. Then one July, I noticed he was always gone before close, even on busy nights, like he had somewhere to be. Asterisk. Claire looked up at Diane. "Did you take this to Bud?" Diane's expression didn't change. Page 10, she said. Asterisk. Ruth Halsey is a known gossip. Not admissible. Asterisk. Claire read it twice, set the folder down. Bud had known, not everything, but enough to know that a name was circulating. Enough to know that someone had noticed a pattern at that bar stool. Enough to make a phone call and warn someone that someone was looking. The call Bud had made yesterday at noon. Claire hadn't known what it contained. She still didn't, but standing in Diane Mercer's living room with page 10 in her hands, she understood what it had done. She thought of the empty stool at the end of the bar, the coffee cup already gone when she arrived. He had been warned. He had already left. Bud had called. He wasn't worried about Bud. Bud was architecture, old and load-bearing, and committed to staying standing because the alternative was admitting what he'd been holding up all these years. What Bud had said was, "Someone's looking." What Bud had meant was, "I need this to go away quietly." The ferryman looked out the window at the lake road. Somewhere on that road, in the rental cabin, with the porch light on, a young man from Minneapolis was spending his first evening in Harlan. He had seen him in the bar. He had completed the assessment. He had left before the woman with the notepad arrived. He was patient. He had always been patient. The lake, he knew, would still be there. It always was. She stood at the turnoff for 4 minutes. She knew because she timed it. She had no authority, no badge, no case number. She was a university researcher with a data model and a growing certainty that a 24-year-old man in that lit cabin was being watched by something that had done this 11 times. She could knock on his door. Tell him what? That the numbers said he fit a profile? That a woman kept a 6-year archive that no one in law enforcement would look at? That a figure stood in the tree line and a man at a bar drank coffee and left before she arrived? She could not tell him any of that and have it mean anything. She needed one more thing. Just one. She turned away from the cabin road, walked back toward the sheriff's office. Behind her, in the lit window of cabin 3, Tommy Greer's silhouette moved across the glass, alive, unaware, present, for now. He'd requested the audio file from dispatch, quietly, off the record. The 2019 anonymous call, the one Bud had logged as a noise complaint. Dispatch had the recording. They always did. Bud had never asked for it to be pulled, because Bud had never wanted to hear the voice. Hank sat in the empty office and listened to it for the first time. Male, calm. A voice that had no urgency in it. Reporting a disturbance the way you report a weather observation. Something seen, described, released. Hank had grown up in Harlan. He had known every voice in this town for 38 years. He sat very still for a long time after the recording ended. When Claire pushed open the office door at 9 p.m., Hank was still sitting there, phone face down on the desk, hands flat, not moving. She looked at him. "You know who it is," she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Play it again," Claire said. Hank pressed play. The recording was 43 seconds long. A male voice, unhurried, reporting a disturbance near the dock. Approximate location given accurately. Time noted. No name. No callback number. The call disconnected before dispatch could ask. Claire listened with her eyes closed. Not to the words, to the texture of the voice, the specific control in it, the absence of anything that sounded like a person who had just witnessed something disturbing. She opened her eyes. "He's done this before," she said. "You can hear it. The call isn't practiced. It's automatic. This is just how he sounds when he does this." Hank said nothing. His jaw worked once. "You recognize the voice," Claire said again, quieter this time. Not an accusation, almost gentle. "I need you to say it out loud, Hank." Hank stood at the window for a long time. "I've known him my whole life," he finally said. The words came out flat, scraped clean of everything that should have been attached to them. "He coached my little league team. He sat in the front row at my mother's funeral. He shoveled her driveway for 3 winters when she couldn't do it herself." He pressed his forehead briefly against the cold glass. "He is the most—" The sentence stopped. Started again. "Everyone in this town would tell you he is the most decent man they have ever known." Claire waited. "That's not a defense," Hank said. His voice had gone very quiet. "I know that's not a defense. He turned from the window. His face in the bad fluorescent light looked like something that had been carrying too much weight for too long and had just been asked to carry one thing more. "I need to be sure," he said. "Before I say his name, I need to be absolutely sure. Give me something I can verify independently," Claire said. "Not the voice. Something on paper." She pulled up property records. Vehicle registrations. Harlan resident database going back 20 years. Cross-reference, she said, half to herself, half to Hank. Continuous Harlan residency. Male. Age range compatible with a voice that hasn't changed significantly across 7 recordings, spanning 11 years. She paused, narrowed the filter. Regular, at the tap. Known to bar staff across that entire period. The database returned 43 names. She narrowed further. No criminal record. Because of course there wouldn't be one. No red flags in any official system. Because of course there wouldn't be. 31 names. Add one more filter, Hank said quietly from behind her. His voice had changed. Something had settled in it. Something decided. He volunteers. Has for years. Lake safety. Water rescue. Claire's hands stopped on the keyboard. She turned slowly to look at him. 7 names. He had been coming to this lake for 31 years. He had been doing this, the specific this, for 11. He didn't think of it as a decision he had made. He thought of it as a recognition, a gradual understanding of what he was for. The lake received what the lake was given. That was simply true. The water didn't judge the weight. The water didn't ask what had brought something to its surface. He thought of the young man in the cabin, the light in that window, the easy, unguarded way he'd sat in the bar. He thought of the woman with the notepad. He was not afraid of her. He had nothing in any system that would connect him to anything. He had been careful in ways that went far beyond careful. Careful the way a man is careful when he has turned carefulness into a form of devotion. He reached over and turned the radio off. The silence that followed was complete and comfortable, the way silence is comfortable for a man who has learned to live inside it. Tommy texted his roommate, "Genuinely beautiful up here, man. You should have come." His roommate replied, "Next time for sure. Don't drown." Lol. Tommy sent back a laughing emoji. He put the phone face down on the table, finished his beer. He thought he might go for a walk before bed. The lake was only 5 minutes down the road. He'd driven past the dock earlier. Old weathered wood. The kind of thing that looked better at night, probably. Atmospheric. He'd thought about photographing it. He stood up, grabbed his jacket off the chair back. Behind him, in the dark window, the road was empty. It had been empty for an hour. It had not always been empty for that hour. 7 names. She had the 7 names. She had cross-referenced against Diane's Ruth Halsey account. Always the same stool, always coffee, always gone before close, and against the volunteer water rescue records Hank had pulled from county archives in under 4 minutes once he'd decided to stop hesitating. One name appeared in every filter. Every single one. Paper trail clean. Record spotless. Community standing unimpeachable. Lived 300 meters from the lake road for 31 years. Claire wasn't calling Bud. Bud had already made his call. She was calling the county sheriff's office in the next jurisdiction, a number Diane Mercer had given her 2 days ago, with the quiet pragmatism of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 6 years. "I need an emergency welfare check," she said when the line connected. "Rental cabin on Harlan Lake Road. Occupant is a 24-year-old male, matching a victim profile in an open pattern investigation. I need someone there now." She was already moving toward the door. They'd taken Hank's personal vehicle as far as the road split, then on foot, because a patrol car with lights would announce them to anyone watching from the trees. Claire kept her phone in her hand. The county welfare check was en route. 12 minutes out, the cabin lights were on. That was something. The dock path branched left 40 meters ahead, the worn gravel turning toward the water, and Claire felt the specific cold of understanding move through her. If Tommy had decided on that walk, if he'd gone toward the dock before the welfare check arrived, if he was on that path right now in the dark and the fog, she walked faster. Hank matched her without being asked. The tree line to their right was silent. Everything was always silent here. That had stopped feeling like peace a long time ago. The dock was better at night. He'd been right about that. The fog made everything look like a film still. He took out his phone, framed a shot of the dock disappearing into the mist, sent it to his roommate with the caption, "Shatmospheric enough for you?" He walked to the end of the dock, looked down at the water. It was completely black. You couldn't see into it at all. That was strange, he thought vaguely. He'd expected to see the bottom, or at least some depth, but the water gave nothing back. Just the surface, just the reflection of a sky with no stars. He heard something in the tree line. He turned. She saw him at the dock's end, alive, standing, looking toward the tree line to his right. She followed his gaze. The trees were dark. The shadows between the pines gave nothing back. She had no way of knowing if the tree line was empty. She had no way of knowing if what Tommy had heard was wind or water or something that had stood in that exact spot 11 times before and knew exactly how long to wait. "Tommy," she said his name at normal volume, not a shout. Calm, carrying, the voice you use when you need someone to hear you without startling them. He turned, saw her, raised a hand, easy, puzzled, unafraid. The tree line did not move. 8 minutes until the welfare check arrived. Claire walked onto the dock, toward him, steady, not looking at the trees, knowing that whatever was in them was looking at her. "Didn't expect to see you out here," Tommy said. He was smiling. Still easy, still unaware. "Small town," Claire said. She kept her voice level. She kept herself between him and the trees. "You hear that?" he asked, nodding toward the tree line. "Something moving in there. Probably a deer." "Probably," Claire said. She did not look at the trees. She kept her eyes on Tommy's face, using it as a mirror, watching for the moment his expression would register something behind her. Hank was at the dock entrance. She could see him in her peripheral vision, hand on his radio, body positioned at the path's mouth, blocking the only exit from the dock back to the road. The tree line was silent now. That was worse than sound. "Actually," Claire said, "I was going to get a coffee. You know the diner on Main stays open late?" She kept talking. It didn't matter what she said. She needed his feet moving. Off the dock, onto the path, away from the water, and toward the road where Hank was standing and wherein. She checked her phone in one fast glance. 4 minutes. A county welfare vehicle would be pulling up. Tommy said something about preferring the bar's coffee. She agreed with him. Beneath the dock, the water lapped once against the pilings. A small sound, ordinary, and then was quiet again. She did not look back at the tree line. She kept talking. She kept him moving. She kept her hand just barely on his arm, the lightest possible pressure, guiding him the way you guide someone away from an edge they haven't seen. He watched them go. The woman had come from nowhere. She had come from exactly the right direction at exactly the wrong time. That was interesting. That was worth considering. He did not feel panic. He had never felt panic. It had been designed out of him by years of patience and the specific discipline of a man who has only ever operated in the long game. She had moved the young man deliberately, placed herself between him and the trees, known somehow where to stand. She was not law enforcement. He had confirmed that through Bud. She had no authority to act on what she suspected. Whatever she had, it was circumstantial. It would stay circumstantial as long as he stayed exactly as he had always been. Known, trusted, unimpeachable. He turned back into the trees. The fog closed behind him without a sound. He had done this before. The season was long. Tommy was safe. That was the operative fact. He was confused and slightly indignant and asking questions that the welfare officer was deflecting with professional patience. He would be moved to a motel in the next town tonight. He had not been told exactly why. Claire watched him from 20 feet away. He was there, she said quietly, to Hank. Not a question. Yes, Hank said, just as quietly. He was watching from the same position. The same spot in the trees. She paused. He saw me move, Tommy. He saw me place myself. He knows I know the location. Hank was silent for a moment. Which means he knows you know more than a data model, he said. Yes. Across the road, Tommy looked back at Claire over the welfare officer's shoulder. Still confused, still alive. Claire looked back at him for a moment. Then she turned away. There was work left. Diane looked at the folded paper for a long time without taking it. You know who it is, Claire said, gently. I've known for 3 years, Diane said. Her voice was the same quiet it always was, but underneath it, something that had been compressed for a very long time. You didn't put the name in your files. No. Diane looked at the paper, then at Claire. Because I was afraid if I wrote it down, something would happen to the files. Or to me, she paused. And because I needed someone else to find it independently, so that when it mattered, it wasn't just a grieving mother who couldn't let go. She reached out and took the paper, unfolded it, read the name she already knew. She folded it again, pressed it against her chest for one moment. Eyes closed, one breath, and then she set it carefully on top of Kevin's file. What happens now? She asked. Claire wished she had a better answer. The county had run a welfare check on his Lake Road without informing him first. That was Claire Osei. That was exactly Claire Osei. Bud sat in his office and did what he had been doing for 22 years. He tried to find the version of events in which everything was still manageable. He had not known. That was true. He had never known. Not with certainty. Not with the kind of knowing that required action. He had known the way a man knows that a structural beam in his house might be compromised. Not looking too closely because looking closely meant the house might fall. He had built a life in this town. He had a daughter here. He had buried his wife from that church on Main Street. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. The number he almost called, the same number from yesterday, he did not call. For the first time in 11 years, he put the phone in his drawer and left it there. He came to the back room when he needed to think clearly. The binders contained nothing incriminating. He had been precise about that. No names, no dates, no locations, only numbers, sequences, the private notation system of a man who needed to remember without leaving anything that could be read. He pulled the 2018 binder from the shelf, opened it to the center, looked at the notation he had made on the night in question. His hand was perfectly steady. He had not wavered then. He did not waver now. What had shifted was the variable he had not accounted for. A woman with a data model who had stood on this lake's dock in the dark and known exactly where to position herself. He closed the binder, returned it to its place. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who recalculated. And what the recalculation told him, standing in this room among 11 years of careful notation, was simple. The season was not over, and neither was he. She stood back and looked at it. 11 years, 11 victims, one center point. The map was complete now, not in the way that meant finished, but in the way that meant the shape was finally visible. The whole shape, not fragments, not correlations. the actual architecture of what had been living in this town for 31 years, operating for 11, watched over and protected by a system of comfortable non-looking that had dressed itself as community and called itself trust. She thought about Hank, about what it cost him to say the name, about what it would cost him further. She thought about Bud, about what he had and hadn't known, and the distinction between those two things that would matter enormously in a courtroom, and not at all to Diane Mercer. She looked at the name on the index card at the center of the map. Tomorrow she would take this to the county DA. Not Bud, not this jurisdiction. Over Bud's head and past his reach. She turned off the light. The map stayed in the dark. The name at its center stayed there too, patient and waiting, the way it had always been patient. Waiting had never served him before. She intended to change that. She had arrived at 8. She had an appointment at 8:30. She had been in the building since 7:45, sitting in a corridor with her documentation in a folder on her lap, going through it one final time. DA Patricia Voss read without speaking for 11 minutes. Claire counted. She had nothing else to do with her hands. Voss turned the last page, removed her glasses, set them on the desk, looked at Claire directly. The full attention look, the one that meant she was reading the person now, not the paper. This is a statistical model and a body of circumstantial evidence, Voss said. Her voice was precise, not dismissive. Precise. You understand the distinction? Yes, Claire said. I also have an audio recording and a deputy prepared to testify that his supervising officer suppressed a witness account in 2019. Voss picked up her glasses, put them back on, reached for the USB drive. Tell me about the deputy, she said. Claire told her about Hank, about the 7 reports, about the note in the margin, mother requests follow-up call, and the call that was never made. About the 2019 recording retrieved from dispatch without Bud's knowledge. She told her about Bud's call, the noon call, the day she arrived, the warned departure from the bar stool before Claire got there. Voss listened without interrupting. The pen moved occasionally, not notes, just motion, the habit of a hand that thinks by moving. The sheriff called to warn a suspect, Voss said when Claire finished. I can't prove the content of that call, Claire said. I can only prove the timing. Voss was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, gray sky, a town that wasn't Harlan, which was the point. Circumstantial is not nothing, Voss said finally. Circumstantial, stacked with sufficient weight and consistency, is how most of these cases actually close. She leaned forward. What I need that you haven't given me yet, she set the USB drive down between them, is something that puts him at the water. Bud had not mentioned the welfare check. He had come in at his usual time, made coffee, gone to his office. He had not looked at Hank differently. He had not looked at Hank at all, which was its own form of differently. Hank typed a report he was not thinking about. He had given Claire the recording. He had said the name. He had done those things, and they were done. And there was no version of the next days in which Harlan stayed the same. He thought about the Little League team, about his mother's driveway, about 38 years of a man being the thing this town pointed to when it wanted to say, this is what decent looks like. He thought about Kevin Mercer's mother sitting alone in a house 600 feet from this lake for 6 years. He typed another line of the report he wasn't writing. In his peripheral vision, Bud's silhouette had not moved in 40 minutes. Glenn had called him, not the other way around. That was worth noting. Glenn calling first meant Glenn was afraid. Glenn afraid meant the perimeter of the thing was showing to people who should not be able to see it. He sat in the pew and watched Glenn descend the steps with his hands clasped, and his expression arranged into the pastoral concern that Glenn deployed the way other men deployed a uniform, automatically, completely, without it meaning anything about what was underneath. I heard about the welfare check, Glenn said. He sat in the pew beside him, not in front, beside, which meant this was not a pastoral visit. It was a conversation between two men who had shared a silence for a long time. There's a researcher from the university, Glenn continued. She's been, I know who she is, he said quietly. Glenn's hands tightened in his lap. And? He looked at the colored light falling through the east window. It made the floor look like something that had been stained. And nothing has changed, he said. She went to the county DA this morning, Glenn said. His voice had lost its shape, the pastoral resonance gone. Just a man in a pew, scared. "I know," the ferryman said. He had assumed this was coming since the dock, since she had placed herself between him and the young man with the deliberate precision of someone who knew exactly where he would be standing. "Glenn." He said the name gently, almost kindly. Glenn looked at him, the pale blue eyes carrying something that had been building for years, the specific weight of a man who had not done anything and had therefore allowed everything. "Whatever she has," the ferryman said, "it isn't enough. It won't be enough. I have spent 31 years making certain that there is nothing that is enough." Glenn looked down at his clasped hands. "Kevin Mercer's mother came to me in 2019, Glenn said quietly. "She asked me if I knew anything. I told her I didn't." The ferryman said nothing. "I didn't lie," Glenn said, as if the distinction still mattered, as if saying it again might make it true in some new way. The colored light moved slightly as a cloud crossed outside. The church held its breath, something that puts him at the water. Voss had said it with the precision of someone identifying the exact missing piece of an otherwise complete structure. Claire had the pattern. She had the timeline. She had the voice recording, and the tree line position, and the worn earth, and Diane Mercer's 6 years of documentation and Hank's testimony about suppression. She did not have a single piece of physical evidence that placed him at that dock on any of those 11 nights. No DNA. No footprint analysis. The earth was worn but not preserved. No camera coverage on the dock path in any of those years. No witness who had seen him there. She turned from the board, sat at the folding table, opened her laptop, something that puts him at the water. She stared at the screen. Then, slowly, she opened the property records database again, not looking at his house this time, looking at the dock, at who built it, at who maintained it, at who, for 31 years, had volunteered for the Lake Safety Committee that oversaw the dock's annual inspection. She sat forward. There it was. "You gave her the recording," Bud said. "Not an accusation. Not quite. The voice of a man who has arrived at a fact and is simply confirming it before deciding what to do with it." "Yes," Hank said. Bud nodded slowly. His hand tightened on the doorframe once and then released. "I've known him 40 years, Bud said. The same thing Hank had said. The same sentence. As if they'd both been carrying it, and neither had known the other was carrying it too. Hank waited. "I didn't know," Bud said. Then, quieter, "I didn't let myself know." "That's not the same thing." He looked at the floor. "I think I've been telling myself it was." The fluorescent tube ticked once. "What do you need from me?" Bud asked. Hank looked at his former supervisor, at the man who had closed 11 cases and written asterisk unrelated noise complaint and taken a statement about a regular at a bar stool and called it gossip. "The 5 files," Hank said, "the ones in archive storage that aren't in archive storage." A long silence. Then Bud pushed off the doorframe and walked back to his desk. He came to the dock after leaving the church. He needed to stand here. He came when he needed to think. And he needed, after Glenn's fear and Bud's call and the woman with her notepad and her data, he needed to stand in the one place that had always been true. The water was the same. It was always the same. It did not know about district attorneys or data models or audio recordings or a deputy who had finally said a name. He looked down at the black surface. He had a plan. He had, in fact, always had a contingency. The way a careful man always has a contingency, a version of events that could be constructed from what existed and what didn't, and what could be made to look like what. He was not afraid. But standing at the dock's end with the water below him and 31 years behind him, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The specific sensation of a system running close to its limit. Not failure, not yet, just close. He turned and walked back up the dock. Behind him, the water did not move. It never did, not until it had to. The 5 folders had been in Bud's personal filing cabinet, not archive storage, his cabinet, the one with the key he kept on his person. He hadn't looked at them in 3 years. He hadn't needed to. They existed not to be used, but to be kept. The way certain things are kept, not because they have value, but because destroying them would require acknowledging they existed in the first place. Bud lifted his hand from the stack. "The 2015 file," he said. His voice had changed. The authority scraped out of it, something older and more tired underneath. "There's a witness statement in there. A fisherman saw a kayak on the water at 2 a.m., logged the registration number." He paused. "I told him it was probably just an early riser. I didn't run the registration." Hank looked at him. "I know," Bud said, before Hank could say it. I know. He pushed the stack across the desk. His hand cleared it completely. Then he folded both hands in his lap and looked at the wall and did not say anything else. She took them without speaking, set them on the folding table, removed the rubber bands carefully, not tearing, not rushing, and opened the first one. Hank stayed in the doorway. He didn't come in. The room was Claire's free. He understood that. He was a courier tonight, not a partner. She read for 4 minutes. Then she stopped, looked up. 2015, she said. Kayak registration. 2 a.m. Lake Harlan. Yes. She looked back down. Her finger moved to the registration number, written in a fisherman's hand, 31 years ago, of patience distilled into 10 digits on a yellowed form. She turned to her laptop, ran the registration. The result came back in seconds. She looked at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called D.A. Voss. It was 11:47 p.m. Voss answered on the second ring. I have physical placement, she said when Voss picked up. 2015. Kayak registration on the water at 2 a.m. Logged by an independent witness. Registration links directly to the subject. The witness statement was in a suppressed file. Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. That's 9 years old, she said. Not dismissing, assessing. And it puts him on the water, not at the dock. It puts him on the lake at 2 a.m. in the same window as a drowning that was ruled accidental. Combined with the audio recording, the treeline evidence, the call logs, it's enough to open a formal investigation, Voss said. It is not yet enough to charge. Claire understood the distinction. She had understood it since the beginning. Opening was not closing, but opening was how closing began. I need the witness, Voss said. The fisherman. Is he still in Harlan? Claire looked at the file. The name. The address from 2015. She turned to Hank in the doorway. He was already reaching for his phone. He felt it at 11:50. Not an alarm. He had no alarm systems, no surveillance. Nothing that could be subpoenaed. He felt it the way he felt all things, as a shift in the atmospheric pressure of his situation, a change in what the silence contained. The fisherman. He had thought about the fisherman over the years. Old Walt Briggs, 73 now if he was still alive, who had been out on the water at 2 a.m. because Walt had never slept well, and the lake in the small hours was the only thing that helped. Walt had seen the kayak. Walt had given a statement. Bud had told him it was nothing, and Walt had believed him, because Walt trusted Bud the way everyone trusted Bud. But Walt was still in Harlan. Walt had lived on Pitcher Road for 50 years and was not the kind of man who left. He stepped back from the window, walked to the hallway, opened the garage door. The kayak was on the wall, the dry bags on the shelf. The side door, the one facing the lake road, waited. He stood in the garage for a long time. This was the contingency, not for the lake, for the witness. Walt Briggs, Pitcher Road, 2 miles from the lake road. Hank had the address memorized from the file. He was doing 60 on a gravel road and telling himself Walt was fine. Walt was asleep. Walt was unreachable for any purpose.